All right, so welcome to lecture 5. This is iOS. So we started talking last week about Objective-C and really just the syntax, and we used it only in the context of macOS-based applications, command line applications. So today we actually introduce stuff that's germane to iPhones and iPads and the like. And the nice thing is that a lot of the topics that we're going to start playing with, we really did play with already in the context of PHP, because the iOS SDK, Software Development Kit, is all about MVC, Model View Controller. And so you're going to see the same paradigm, but realize you're going to see some different jargon. You're going to see lots of different features of the GUI. And for the most part, what we'll try to do this week and after spring break is guide you through what might otherwise be a little overwhelming or complex so that you're empowered both for Project 2 and 3 to dive in and make something of your own. So recall that we changed labs a while back, and just so that folks are taking advantage of these things, we do have this cycle whereby the first week after a project's out and you've submitted your design docs and style guides, that Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday are meant to be design reviews. So rather than have to wait several days to get feedback via email as we tried for Project 0, the idea here is that you and or your partner can drop by, consult with one or more of the TFs who are there, and get immediate feedback so that you don't have to have some artificial delay before you can really dive back in. So don't wait on us. In fact, if you want feedback via email in addition to these design reviews, per my email a couple weeks back, it's expected that you email your TF with any and all questions that you have. Otherwise, we're there as this resource 3 times a week. Code reviews are the same idea once you've submitted your alpha, so that's what we'll do this coming week. And then the week before releases are due will be just general open office hours. So with the first 2 of these, expect the TFs to proactively come up to you and say, hey, you want to give me a quick tour of your design and or code? Office hours, you are meant to raise your hand or draw us over to you. All right, so here was the simplest of Objective-C applications. The difference, even though we spoke only briefly about it, between import and include, as we see in C, is what? Yeah.
Import only includes it once.
Perfect. Import only includes it once, so like PHP's require once, you get that same functionality. You don't have to worry about doubly including it. And because if you did have to worry about that and you had some class definition or some global variable, you might accidentally doubly define it, and the compiler would not like that. Foundation.h just refers to Apple's foundation classes. These are a lot of the things that start with NS, next step something, and these are either primitives that are typedefs for things like ints and chars, or they are more interesting things like NSString and actual classes that we started playing with. We'll see some more today. Int, main, argc, and whatnot, that's pretty much the same as you might see in C. We're not really going to use that henceforth in iOS because there is no command line per se in these applications. They're GUIs, but we'll still see a main function. It's just you won't need to write it anymore. At auto release pool. We'll talk more about this after break in the context of memory management, but for now, just assume that this is the magic that handles memory management for you. You don't need to worry about calling free. You do need to worry about calling alloc once in a while, but you don't have to worry about, again, the converse. And we'll talk about why before long. This is a relatively new feature. So again, if you're using older books or online resources, it didn't exist before June, give or take. So just realize this is a new feature of iOS 5. NSLog is a proper logging function, but for our purposes, it's pretty much like printf. It lets us see things on the console. You wouldn't typically use it in your production code, and return 0 is just as we've seen in C. So that was a quick rapid tour of where we left off last week. Any questions about the general framework here? Yeah?
If you do log something on like production code, what does that do on the actual iOS device?
Good question. If you recall NSLog in production code on a program you've burned into your phone or iPad, it will actually get logged to the device's memory. And if you connect it via iTunes or rather with Xcode, you can actually see those logs. Not all that helpful if you have thousands of users elsewhere, but for debugging purposes, you can use it that way. But generally, they should be turned off because it's just going to clutter disk space unnecessarily. Good question. All right. So this was now object-oriented programming. So we had some abilities to define what we call classes, which are like templates or molds out of which we can instantiate objects, specific incarnations thereof. Just recall that the jargon in Objective-C is to say at interface. So those of you who knew Java, this is like the keyword class. PHP, it's like the keyword class, but they call it interface. The colon here denotes what? Colon after the class name. Yeah, inheritance. So this just means that foo descends from the NS object class. And what descends means in object-oriented programming is you inherit everything that NS object has. So if it's got methods, if it's got data inside of it, the foo class gets all of that stuff plus it can now add its own thing. So this is a useful thing when trying to create some kinds of hierarchies or to avoid having to reinvent the wheel. Recall that we had the alloc method and even the init method, and even if we didn't implement those ourselves, we did have them, and that's because we stole them really from our parent class NSObject. So typically, you'll descend from this if you want that functionality, but it's not strictly required. Inside of the curly braces, you can put instance variables. What's the difference between an instance and a class variable? I know, yeah.
Unless you instantiate the object, you can't use the methods.
Perfect. So unless you instantiate an object of the class, you don't have instance variables accessible to you. By contrast, class methods or class variables, or static variables, as they're sometimes called, exist inside the class itself, inside the mold, and are shared then across all instantiations of the object. So for the most part in Objective-C, to be honest, we'll almost always use instance variables, but we'll point them out if we ever need to do something a little different than this model. And then lastly, and don't forget the syntactic confusion, the declarations of methods with minus signs or plus signs go outside the curly braces, but before at end. And it's not strictly necessary to even have these curly braces if you have no instance variables. So you'll see in Apple's templates for iOS 5 that sometimes that's not even there. But don't worry, it could be there if you had instance variables. So another thing we're about to start seeing today and onward is this use of something called categories. In Objective-C, you can augment the functionality of a class by defining a category. If you know JavaScript well, you can think of this as extending the prototype of an object and adding functionality to an existing object or class, so to speak. And you can also think of this kind of like inheritance in that you can add functionality to an object, but without having to extend it and without having to create some hierarchy. So what I mean by this is this. If we have on the previous slide a class called foo, and it's got some methods, and we decide, you know what, we want to add some more methods to this, even if it's an existing class that we ourselves didn't write, like NSString, you can add methods to it by saying, again, at interface foo, and then in parentheses, an arbitrary name for the category. So I chose bar arbitrarily. A common convention is to put no name whatsoever, open paren, close paren, that says here's a category, or really the jargon here is here's a class extension, which is maybe more clear than calling it a category. And then when I say dash void baz, that's defining a new instance method called baz, returns void, takes no arguments, but that's now part of the foo class. It's just in a category unto itself. So this can be used for a couple of reasons. One, it allows you to add functionality to classes other people wrote without having to extend them. And this is useful for now, just assume, because it allows us to add some functionality over here, over here, over here, without having to come up with this rigid vertical conceptually hierarchy, and that'll make more sense in the future. And it also allows us to impose some kind of visibility constraints. It's going to allow us to add secret methods, if you will, or secret properties to objects without having to declare them in our .h file. But we'll see that. Yeah?
Can you use it like a mixin, or is it?
Yeah, that's exactly the idea here. Yeah?
If you wanted,
Oh, you first, Charles.
if you wanted to call that baz method, would you need to create an object of type bar? Or would it still be an object?
No, so bar is not a class. Bar is the category name, and for the most part, it's arbitrary. It just needs to be unique. Foo is still the class name. So you would need to create an object of type foo in order to pass it the baz message, aka call the bar method. Baz method. Yeah. Same question. OK. All right, so a little, oh, yep, Kevin?
If you had say a method called baz in the original class, would it overwrite it, or does it raise an error, or how does that work?
Oh, that's a good question. Tommy, do you know the answer to that? OK, neither of us know. We'll try to figure it. I don't know. If you actually try to override the method name but in a category, I'm not sure, but let me check. If you do inheritance, it overrides it. I'm not sure of the behavior in a category, but easy enough to test. All right, so a couple other building blocks of Objective-C, and then we'll transition to Xcode and iOS GUI stuff. So a protocol is one other thing that I think I mentioned in passing last week, which is similar in spirit to PHP's and to Java's interface. Again, not to be confused with Objective-C's interface, which means class. In this case, a protocol, as specified in angled brackets there, means that this class implements a whole bunch of methods that are declared in a protocol called nscopying. So in other words, there's some file, probably nscopying.h on the system somewhere, and it lists, top to bottom, a whole bunch of instance methods and or class methods with minuses and pluses. That's all it does. Arguments, return types, all of that. When I now declare a student class as implementing, in angled brackets, the nscopying protocol, that just means that I am promising